Thank you. Welcome. On behalf of the Council and the Secretariat of the Kenya section of the International Commission of Jurists, and on behalf of the civil society organizations that have partnered with us to hold this event, it is an honor to address you this afternoon and to welcome you all to this webinar addressing the crisis in Ethiopia. On November 4th, 2020, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced that he had ordered the Ethiopian National Defence Forces, the ENDF, to launch a military operation in the Tigray region. He accused the regional ruling Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF government, of attacking the ENDF's northern command based in the provincial capital, Mekelle, after months of continued incitement and violence by the TPLF. An armed conflict within the region ensued. And on November 22nd, the Prime Minister Abiy gave the Tigrayan forces 72 hours to surrender before a military offensive began. The Tigrayan capital of Mekelle is home to 500,000 civilians, and furthermore, 96,000 Eritrean refugees live in Tigray who have now been affected by this conflict. The Ethiopian Defence Forces now reports that it controls the key positions in Tigray since the offensive began, and this includes the towns of Dansha and Humera in the west, Shire in the north, and Alamata and Mohoni in the south. There are unconfirmed reports that the ENDF has taken control of several other towns. On the humanitarian side, Tigray already had 600,000 people dependent on food relief, and more than 400,000 are food insecure. There were 100,000 IDPs and nearly 100,000 other refugees. This conflict has already exacerbated a very serious refugee crisis that has spilled over to the neighboring countries in Eritrea and Sudan. There are reports of arrests now of Tigrayan businessmen and residents in Addis Ababa and other parts of the country, and a communication blackout around the region that is only slowly beginning to ease. The information on the humanitarian situation and the civilian impact is not yet clear. The ongoing internal conflict and the intercommunal violence in other parts of the country are manifestations of an underlying ethnic and political polarization in the country, testifying to the urgent need for an all-inclusive dialogue between the different political factors. So against this background, ICJ Kenya, Crisis Action, Femnet, CIHA, Atrocities Action Africa, and other civil society organizations have decided to come together so that we can have a discussion on our role in the de-escalation and solidarity with organizations and people of Ethiopia. This webinar will further provide an opportunity for us to discuss the different strategies we can employ to help our sisters and brothers in Ethiopia. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining. My name is Mbuda. I'm the chief of Justice Watch, and I'm going to be the one moderating this webinar. We have a very good, excellent group of panelists that are going to help us discuss the matter and be able to have at least some outcomes may be used for civil action on Ethiopia. We have two Ethiopians and we have two regional and national actors who also can give us a perspective based on their knowledge of the region and based on knowledge of the workings of many of the Africa. So to kick us off, we will start with the Miss Saba Medin. Saba Medin is the executive director of the Network for Ethiopian Women Associations, and is a women's rights activist, a civil society leader known for launching successful campaigns on violence against women and effective policy engagement on gender equality. She provides strategic leadership to NEWA, coming up with initiatives of adopting on how to deal with repressive CSO legislation. She is an ardent advocate on CSO reform. Please allow me to welcome Saba. Saba, the question that I have is, you inside Ethiopia, understand Ethiopia better. What is the underlying problem that has caused this conflict in Ethiopia?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, maybe I was not prepared to speak on the factors for conflict. Thought Masood would be covering that, but more on how the CESO's reaction towards this. So maybe since Masood is prepared on this, I'll give Masood the chance and I'll answer the next question. Thank you.
Masood, please.
Okay, thank you all for organizing this discussion, which is very much important for us. And maybe Abdu has been giving some background information about the situation. So when we see the causes and the level of the conflict that we are in now as a nation, and when we see the role of civil societies, I need to make some remarks. As it has been already given as a background, before this conflict comes, there have been, especially when we see generally the reform process, there have been some internal problems among the ruling party, to which the EPRDF was mainly led by the TPLF fighters. And I mean, in terms of internal power politics issues, there have been problems. And since these kinds of public resistance started in Ethiopia, maybe some 5-6 years ago, there have been lots of internal challenges, and especially following the COVID-19 pandemic. As we all know, many elections in the world have been for some time suspended, and Ethiopia was not an exception. And for that matter, the National Electoral Board of Ethiopia has announced that in the time of COVID, it is not possible for Ethiopia to have that election. And based on the recommendation of the NEBE, the parliament has decided that the election would be suspended for some time until the Ethiopian Public Health Institute and the Ethiopian Ministry of Health, in consultation with World Health Organization, come up with the possible recommendations on that matter. So when this was communicated, there have been internal discussions among the different political actors, including TPLF and other founding members of the EPRDF. Even if it is not that much full-fledged, some civil societies were also consulted, especially about the scenario of then what would be the next, because our constitution was somehow unclear on conditions like this, which we were not able to automatically apply some provisions of the constitution, and there were scenarios developed. And when these scenarios were developed, the participation of political parties was not that much as we were anticipating, and even we as civil societies were not well informed and participated in such discussions. And this all passed, and the problem was the government needed to decide as soon as possible because it would create some kind of lacuna. And finally, it was decided that the constitution should be interpreted. Passing all these processes, the House of Federation, the Parliament decided on this. Following these decisions, there have been some opinions. Still, there are opinions about the legitimacy of such. Some question about the legitimacy of even the Parliament, even the House of Federation, and even the acceptance, the public acceptance of such decisions. Then, in these all processes, there have been tension between among the members of the former ruling party. Now the PP is formally leading the country, and this leads to tension between TPLF and the PP. So then there have been different questions from the civil society. For instance, when the COVID comes, the Tigray region has issued a state of emergency while the federal government didn't come up with that. So these have been some of the legal issues that people were, especially lawyers, were raising. Even we as civil societies demanded to have a uniform application of the state of emergency, because it is not something that happens only in one region. It is a global pandemic, and for that it needs to be handled in a synergized way. So these problems escalated, and in many parts of the country there have been lots of displacement conflicts, and for all these conflicts, the federal government often alleges the involvement in different capacities of some groups, and mainly the TPLF. And the TPLF has been trying to delegitimize the PP. So it seems like the kind of PP and TPLF, but now it changed that, and finally the federal government announced to the public that the northern command of the defense force has been attacked by the Tigrayan militia and special forces. And it was confusing for us even that time, when it was the tension increases. We as civil societies demanded the de-escalation of such conflicts so that the two parties to sit together. But finally, it was even from among the central committee leaders of the TPLF, it was confirmed that the federal government was indeed attacked by members of the special forces and the militia of the Tigray region. Then it comes a kind of full-fledged, it seems like a kind of war, but later on it was taken, and the federal government reported that this is a kind of law enforcement. And of course, the TPLF forces also attacked some areas like Bahar Dar, Gondar, even Asmara was attacked for that matter. And following this problem, the number of people displaced increased. The humanitarian assistance was also as such very much increasing from day to day. Of course, now it seems before 2 or 3 days, the federal government announced that they have controlled the capital city of the region, Mekelle, and now they are reporting that they are now searching those who are behind all these atrocities. And as we all know, especially in the area of Mekelle, lots of people were killed based on, according to the preliminary reports of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and Amnesty International. It was a kind of identity-based attack. So all these kinds of problems happen. So then, as civil society, we are in such problem. I mean, as a nation, this is something that we really don't deserve, because we have lots of other national agendas, but this problem happens. And as you all know, it is only after the reform that civil society is working on advocacy, working on human rights, working on governance and conflict management, were able to at least revive again. And they didn't have as such the capacity to assist in these areas. Even if we have the National Reconciliation Commission, the Boundary and Identity Commission, which are established by the initiative of the government, still these institutions are not yet owned by the public, and the engagement of civil societies with these organizations is not that much strong. So as civil society and as an Ethiopian, as well as a lawyer, my suggestion is maybe after this consultation, I will be listening the views from other partners, especially from Kenya, from Uganda, from other parts of the continent, who have been almost in similar situations either, or who have at least experiences of different violences, and different local civil societies had played a role. Especially we know the incidents in Uganda, I mean, like in Kenya and other parts of the continent. So we as civil societies need to push that this law enforcement should, at least immediately either, or the humanitarian assistance should be facilitated, and the government should facilitate all this. Of course, the government, we have the chance to talk about the situation, and the spokesperson of the State of Emergency Command Post has briefed the civil societies. And from that discussion, what we understand is civil societies who would be very much helpful in the humanitarian assistance are welcome. And we have also recently established a kind of committee for the humanitarian assistance for those people affected in the northern parts of Ethiopia, especially bringing back those refugees who are in Sudan, building back those infrastructures or assisting the humanitarian. And on the other hand, this is, I mean, something that is not yet common. And when the government moves in the law enforcement process, there need to be some kind of accountability, and we really need accountability for those who have participated in different capacities need to be brought to justice. And for that, civil societies, especially working on investigation, transitional justice, human rights documentation, need to assist local Ethiopian civil society organizations. And I beg all civil society organizations, lawyers who have experiences in different parts of the continent, from Nigeria, from Kenya, from South Africa, and many more, to closely work with local civil society organizations to build their capacity, even if we are at urgency, but still local civil societies need to engage, and this will be the end of similar atrocities in the future. Thank you.
Excellent, Mesedu. That's quite very good intro for us to know what exactly is happening in Ethiopia. I didn't introduce Mesedu. Mesedu is a young human rights defender who has been working on as the director of the consortium of the Ethiopian Human Rights Organization since 2016. The consortium is the only coalition of human rights CSOs in Ethiopia that advocates for civil society participation in law and policy reform in the country. Mesedu is also the vice president of the Ethiopian Civil Society Forum, a network of more than 1,100 CSOs. So thank you very much, Mesedu. I think we'll be getting people to ask you some questions, and if people have questions, they can drop them into the chat box. We'll be able to get back to them. But even in the plenary, when we come to the plenary, if people have questions to ask you, they'll ask you. So now I would ask also timekeeping. At least we take about 10 minutes of presentation. But if the time is allowed, so that we can be able to ask questions and get into a fuller discussion. Now, over to you, Saba. I had already introduced you. What is your take on exactly what is happening in Ethiopia?
Thank you, moderator. I think what Masood brought in terms of the condition and the situations happening here in Ethiopia, and especially in Tigray region, and the reasons for conflict has been said. And for me, it will be in our position as civil societies. How did we feel, and how did we participate? How did we influence, or anything that we have done, our reactions in terms of this conflict? And I really want to, for this panel also to you know, in a way of going forward, to see how can civil societies stay influencing, you know, making an impact in a positive manner in such situations like conflict. So when the outbreak happened, of the conflict happened, there was basically, even before that, when some conflicts happen in the country, the civil society has kept quiet in terms of saying, like, if I say this, then it will be political, or saying that I'll be siding this group or the other group. So by every day, as we kept quiet, and as we didn't voice our concerns, then we were losing our voices as well. So when the conflict in Tigray region came, we have as NEWA, we have a webinar where different civil societies, like international organizations, UN agencies, local NGOs, and women associations meet since the COVID pandemic has been spotted here in Ethiopia. We started to talk about gender and COVID, but it went on to be the weekly webinar, kept on to talk also about other issues such as gender-based violence, and now the conflicts that were happening. So as you remember, first the issue was called, the situation was called as armed conflict for some time, but later on government said this is not armed conflict, this is actually, making rule of law, keeping the rule of law, and is a law enforcement process. So at first, when we talked about the issue, we said then we need to react, because as civil society, we stand for civilians, and civilians do not want war or any conflict, and obviously it will affect citizens, women and children and everyone. So we decided to do that, and we started that process. We talked, we wrote, we drafted a presentation, but people were not very comfortable to provide their input to say this or that. So there were a lot of changes to make on the wording. We started with resolution of issues peacefully, and you say, no, we cannot say that because government will not support that. So we have to change the wording for that. And then we changed the wording for conflict and said that we have to leave that out. And then we said about the actors in the conflict should take action, but it's a lesson. So all those ups and downs to even to come up with a single statement took very long. And as the day goes on, the conflict starts to be, we had almost more than 40 organizations in our in the webinar group, but later on only 8 organizations really approved the statement and agreed to give their logos or to give their signatures. So that's how we managed finally to come up with a statement and send it to the media, and we also posted it in our Facebook page. But what I learned from this was that, if as civil society, if we don't voice our concerns on time, we cannot engage, and we cannot shape, we cannot influence, and we don't really stand for the interest of our constituencies. For us, for example, it's women and children, then we didn't say anything. So a large number of people are now, as you can see, are now, leaving the country and going to Sudan, and they are all in refugee camps. All these challenges have come because we're not there to say and to prevent things and to act as we should act. So I identify some things that I learned from this process is that one of the things that make us lose our voices as civil society, what I've seen as Ethiopia as a country, not only because of the conflict that is now in Tigray, but also in that were happening in the last 2 years and more parts of the country, is that we lack consistency. We don't say something when some conflict happens, or when some when human rights violation happens, and then we lose our credibility, and people say, you didn't say this when the other group have been affected, and now you're saying this because this one is affected. So we found ourselves in a very uncomfortable situation. So we prefer to keep quiet. So many organizations that are supposed to be, standing for citizens, for human rights, for good governance, for democracy issues, are now very quiet. That in Ethiopia for the last 10 years we had a very stringent kind of law that prohibited us from engaging in human rights, in women's rights issues, in justice, good governance. But now that law has been changed now, and we are now registered, and everybody is allowed to do this kind of work, whether with foreign funds or with local funds. But in spite of that legal space, conducive policy situation, we are now by our own rights, we are now closing ourselves and not engaging. So one of the things is that I think that we need to have certain principles that guide us as civil society when we voice. That happens only when we are comfortable, or that happens only when certain group of people are affected, or do we say this at any time, at any rate, and then we get the respect, whether it's from government or from other actors in these situations. And the other is not understanding, not only as civil society, but even as citizens, not understanding human rights in its holistic, what is the idea, what is the value of human rights. It's not something that we want to do certain things only when it happens, when if it's the right to speak, or the for press, or for media, and or only if it's political, for political parties. It's I think it's for every citizen, for every group, for all ethnic groups, for all religious groups, for all parties, that happens for all citizens. So we shouldn't classify and departmentalize the issues of human rights. These are human rights and these are not human rights. I think we need to understand that, and we have to, as citizens, as civil society, we should be leading on these principles and values. And I also think that we need to be independent, not only from government or political parties, but independent from our own affiliation, political affiliation, ethnic affiliation, religious affiliations. It is difficult, I know, but as civil society organization or as civil society groups, we are standing for many people. We're not standing there for my ideas. So my idea should not, or my opinion should not influence my actions, my individual opinion. I may have my own affiliation, but I think I need to stand on the values and principles of human rights. That way, then I become credible, and then I become relevant. Otherwise, government will not accept us, other groups will not accept us, people will not accept us, and we will not play our role. So conflict will happen, and security will be highly jeopardized. So what I want to learn from this, since I have only 1 minute, I want to say that maybe how did other, like Masood said, in Kenya, in Uganda, similar situations, when similar situations happen, especially the latest one is in Kenya, I think, where there are ethnic affiliations, and at the same time, where certain things happen. I know that there was a challenge, but how did they come up with becoming, on the principles of human rights and standing always for the issues and showing our concerns. If I don't believe that, bombardment should be away, or if I don't believe that conflict or armed conflict should be away, then I should say it in the right way, not in antagonizing governments only, or any decision-making body, but in a way that informs a process, and that also is honest, and that represents citizens, women, and the group I represent. And more, if we are going to engage in the repatriation, and the after this, a lot of damage is going to happen. So maybe we need to think, how do we assist those harms that already done? How do we heal the harm? How do we heal the pain that's already created on people and on the country? So that's all I have for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. That is very enlightening, in particular the role of civil society in the conflict and the trials and tribulations therein. I'm sure that we'll get to the role of civil society in the region and what kind of role they can play. We have certainly Kenyan is on the call, who would be able to give us their own examples, and if necessary, we can be able to borrow from their experience. Now we can go a little bit regional and seek to know how other countries, and in particular the neighboring countries of Ethiopia, are dealing with the question of Ethiopia within their own countries. And to do
Sorry, panelists and participants, seems we lost Dismas.
Hello?
Dismas, you're back. Yes.
Hi.
Go on, Dismas. Go on.
Where did I stop?
I think you are just about to introduce the next panelist.
All right. I'm sorry, apologies about that. There are complications with the internet in Uganda because they are trying to control a certain presidential aspirant. And so they interfere with it quite often. I was saying that Hala is has woken up very early in the morning. She's in Canada, but she most of her time lives in Uganda. She's an activist and a research practitioner from Sudan. And she is the regional director for the Strategic Initiative for the Women in the Horn of Africa, short for SAIHA. She's a vast human rights, women studies and psychology. Hala work specifically focuses on women and girls' rights. She's an activist, social movement builder, as well as the protection of refugees and displaced persons, and works also on minority communities' challenges that face many within the Horn of Africa. She's also the editorial chief of SAIHA's journal, Women in Islam in the Horn of Africa, which is quite a very interesting journal that most people should read. She does other things, but I think for now, let's welcome her to be able to speak on what she thinks are the implications of Ethiopia on other countries neighboring Ethiopia. Hala, please.
Thank you very much, Dismas. And, greetings to all the friends and the colleagues in this webinar, specifically to my Ethiopian colleagues, Saba, who has been part of the organization I work for over 20 years. And we have been through many tensions and many conflicts in this region together. It's extremely sad, to speak about an armed conflict that's happening in a very dear country like Ethiopia, I really think what Saba has said, that how can we find ways to heal, as a result of this conflict, and how can civil society plays a role, in sort of supporting, at the regional level and nationally, and support the national civil society, to overcome this complex situation. Ethiopia is very strategic and very important country, I believe, for Eastern and Horn of Africa. Ethiopia shares borders with 6 countries around the region, and for the past over 20 years, it kept a very good relationship with its neighboring countries, and influential as well, relationship. Ethiopia has been part of the peace processes in Sudan and in South Sudan. And recently, it helped in negotiating the power sharing agreement in Sudan that led, to the formations of the current Sudanese government. So there is layers of the importance of the role that the Ethiopian government is playing in the region, and Ethiopia, the country, particularly for the countries that I work and I live in, being Sudan, Somalia, and Uganda, and so on. So there is a lot of layers and for the type of relationships. I think I'd like to start by stressing a point that my colleague Saba has talked about, is initially as civil society, we need to be very careful when we are approaching and shaping the narrative around the conflict in Ethiopia. And I think one of the most important issues that we need to pay attention to is, I come from a country that conflicts has been oversimplified or often racialized. So I think, when shaping the narrative, we have to be extremely cautious when it comes to racializing or oversimplifying as external actors, as civil society who is trying to provide support to the activists inside the country, to racialize or oversimplify the conflict, and there is a tendency among the international community to reduce conflicts that happens in our region into just basically a two-party conflicts, and what we know very well that wherever conflicts erupts in this part of the world, it's extremely complex and it has so many layers, and it's not the result of one incident. It's a combination of existing conditions, probably that's been built up for years that led to this situation. So my recommendations initially is to be cautious in our narrative, and when we speak about the conflict, considering the sensitivity of the situation. The other important issue that I would like to talk about, as I said, we're speaking about an extremely strategic country that has connections and shared borders and shared, populations, with many countries, and especially with Sudan and in the case of Sudan, case of South Sudan, and the influx of the refugees that are entering Sudan at the moment from the region, from the conflicts region, and it's and this is happening under a very dire and very complex situation, because Sudan is nowhere near the position of receiving refugees. I mean, the country has already massive number of refugees that are existing within Sudan, but the dire economic situation as the result of COVID and other factors, fragility of the transitional government, and still the legal framework of the country is not accommodating, in a human way or in a human rights way for the refugees who are entering the countries. So I mean, it has always been the case, and it continued to be the case, that refugees who are entering the country are subject to a lot of exploitation and abuse, and a lot of risks. And unfortunately, at this point of time, with a very dire economic situation, we are worried as activists, as civil society, about the notion of xenophobia and and tension against the refugees who are entering the country, and this is based on documentation of several incidents that's happening in the capital city, the fact that Sudan is not fully committed to the Geneva Conventions, and in terms of enabling refugees to settle and work safely, the expectation that refugees should be staying within the camps. There is no infrastructure for camps up to date, and so refugees had to enter into the cities. And there have been incidents of hostilities, people trying to obtain basic food items with the host communities. And this is very unusual. But as I said, this is also speaks to the dire and to the very deteriorating economic situations, in Sudan, and the volatility of the transitional government, who is struggling to provide protections. Something else that I think it's very important for me to highlight is the fact that I mean, over and again, and I know until now we don't have concrete information on the situation of women, but over and again, you know, women become the face of the conflict. And over and again, you know, we are going to hear the stories of sexual violence. We are already hearing that, and abuse among women who are crossing borders, and we are going to hear, you know, the losses that women are going to endure, you know, and they are going to be confronted with as a result of the conflict. And I really think that, you know, as activists and as women rights activists, you know, that this repeated scenario and script that happens as a result of local and civil conflicts, it should not be the norm. And we should have a different modalities and a different approach, you know, in terms of having conversations with our governments and having conversation with our regional bodies. It should not be normalized, and it should not be repeatedly just, you know, it shouldn't be part of the normal conversation. So so I think for that, you know, we need to rethink our engagement interventions, you know, in addressing the ramifications of what's currently happening in Ethiopia. And I think for once, it's very important, you know, to consider the impact, you know, on civilians and on impact of conflicts on civilians and on women's. So I will end my presentation speaks about, you know, there is a need to definitely an urgent need to bring sustainable peace to the region, and where women are significantly given the space during any kind of reconciliations. And we are available to provide support to our Ethiopian sisters, you know, to build bridges of communication, to start the conversations honestly. And how can that be pushed forward and taken seriously? And I think, you know, we are also, you know, willing and very much will be working on, you know, voicing our concern to the Ethiopian government to consider that women and children are in the front line of all this. And there is the need to mobilize the international media to take a responsible notions of reporting on what's happening. And bearing in mind the sensitivity of the situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hala. That was very important for you to raise the issues, in particular, the question of how do we bring about the sustainable peace. I will now move to a person who may probably give us some of the ideas that can bring about that sustainable peace and an understanding, a deeper understanding maybe of the legal implications of the war in Ethiopia. And I'll call on no other than my good brother, Professor Chidi Anselm Odinkalu. He defines himself that he was born a Nigerian, but I know he's more a world citizen than only Nigeria. He's a professor and writer. He's the former chairman of the Nigerian National Human Rights Commission and is currently the senior team manager for the Africa program of the Open Society Justice Initiative. He has worked as an advisor to the Ford Foundation New York, to the World Bank, to the Africa Union, to the International Council for Human Rights Policy in Geneva, and many others. I don't know how best to describe Chidi. If I went through his bio, it's a book in itself, but Chidi is well known on the African continent, and he is going to be our fourth panelist. Chidi Muze, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, General. Thank you also to the colleagues at ICJ and all the partners who have organized this. I can also extend special solidarity to our brothers and sisters in Ethiopia who are living, for the most part, with the consequences of the current situation. I'm also grateful really to be coming after Hala and the framing that she's given this, because if I got her words, I want to repeat her words. Ethiopia is a very strategic and important country for us all. It's not just for people in East Africa or the Horn. It's actually for all of Africa. Ethiopia is the cradle of civilization in many ways. It's also the cradle of sovereignties. It's the only African country that did not go through late colonialism. And many of our people who fought for the colonialists in all their world wars are buried in Ethiopia. Some of our ancestors, certainly some of my own ancestors in Nigeria, are buried in Ethiopia. And speaking as a Nigerian, we do have very strong ties with Ethiopia. And I hope, therefore, that brothers and sisters from Ethiopia and, in fact, the Horn of Africa will forgive us for saying that Ethiopia is too important to be abandoned to Ethiopians alone. And that's really the spirit in which I approach this, that we are all in this together. And if a country as important to all of us Africans, Ethiopia, by the way, is also the headquarters of Africa, which is where the African Union operates from. And if a country as important to our identity and self-definition and existence as that is involved in this situation, we have an obligation not to look away. Indeed, it will be criminal to do so. Now, given that background, what I want to do is basically throw out probably 4 or 5 ideas, broadly speaking. One is about narratives. This partly is a war about, is a crisis about narratives. And it's very interesting that in launching his operation in Tigray, the Prime Minister's first act was to declare this rule of law operations. It said this is a crisis over narratives. Who owns it? Who defines it? Who calls it what? By calling this rule of law operation, he wasn't just sending out a message. He was saying, in effect, this is a matter within Ethiopia's domestic jurisdiction. And therefore, if you're coming in to assert any other thing, you are going contrary to, you are interfering in Ethiopia's domestic jurisdiction. So that assertion of domestic jurisdiction comes up against the reality that there is quite compelling evidence to indicate that some neighboring countries are more than just observers here. Some neighboring countries are actively involved in this situation, servicing the entire conflict value chain, from logistics through intelligence to active deployments. And if you're doing that, if you've got active involvement, therefore, of neighbors, is that a rule of law operation? Because in effect, what you do have is that the assertion of domestic jurisdiction has been breached. Was it breached at the invitation or request of the sovereign, or was it breached by some other understandings? That is a question I think we've got to address. For those of us who are in civil society and for those of us who are from the rest of Africa in diplomatic or governmental circles, the question is, why did this take us by surprise? Because this was a conflict foretold. I don't think that there's anybody who thought something was not going to happen. And yet we were unprepared, not just in terms of trying to see what could be done to avert it, but also in terms of the narrative contestations that have evolved since then. And the question is, how did we get to the point where we were so unprepared for this situation? Now, when you look at Africa, the situation is not new. The contest over how to define conflict and crisis is not new. I am a child of Africa's first rule of law war, the Nigerian Civil War. My parents had me in the second half of the Nigerian Civil War. That war began in 1967 with what the Nigerian government called rule of law operations. It was a police operation, actually. Now, in that police operation in Nigeria, over 3 million people were killed. That was the first African war of the television age. Now, as we fought that war in Nigeria, the Nigerian government until the end called it a rule of law operation. But ironically, one of the countries that was massively involved in trying to give the country a soft landing was Ethiopia. And today, when I listen to everything that happens in Ethiopia, the script of Nigeria and the Nigerian Civil War is played back. And I asked myself, how do we get to this situation where we export these things without drawing the right lessons from them? And this contest over narratives and how this is described comes down to what governs this. Is it human rights law? Is it humanitarian law? Or is it a mix of both? Because humanitarian law would, which is what Ethiopian government wants to avoid, would accord TPLF limited status as a belligerent for the purposes of humanitarian access and of trying to sort out, of achieving de-escalation and applying international accountability for some purposes. So that's the question here. How do you treat the situation in order to address some of the humanitarian crises that Hala has pointed to? And in doing that, two more things. Hala has also described the regional fragilities in terms of conflict, in terms of climate, in terms of communities. And those fragilities are real. It's not just the crisis over the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, or indeed the crisis over the Nile Basin, but there is also crisis in the Gulf of Eden, terrorism, narcotics trade, and of course, intercontinental security across the Gulf, including the countries on the Asian side of the Gulf. Now, how do we, and what is the disposition of the region to this? Because if this is not properly governed, the implications for the region will be extraordinary. How does the region address that reality? I believe that is part of what is engaging the international partners of Ethiopia beyond Africa. How does Africa see that, and what is the attitude of the countries of the region to that reality? Part of that reality is, for those of us who are civil society, the governance implications. You know, this is not Ethiopia's first civil war. 1974 to 1991, Ethiopia did experience a civil war, which launched the EPRDF government. And this is not Ethiopia's first conflict. The Ethio-Eritrean War between 1998 and 2000 was settled by the Algiers Peace Agreement. And that also involved social populations and ethnicities within and around Ethiopia. And so from within, the fragilities relate to social cohesion and social relations. They also relate to governance relations and the political economy. And that goes beyond just Ethiopia. Look, the Ethiopian economy is in difficulty. It's been growing at about 11%. And this is going to peg it back. Ethiopia's population is growing at close to 3%. And at close to 3% of population growth, you need about 9-10% of, broadly speaking, about 9-10% of economic growth to keep pace. If economic growth does not happen at that pace, you're going to be struggling in terms of demand and supply, in terms of how the state provides for public goods and the expectations of its citizens, and that affects social cohesion. That means that in the short run, Ethiopia will struggle for an economy that is so leveraged and dependent on infrastructure investments to try to drive it. Ethiopia is leveraged infrastructure investments. Ethiopia is going to struggle to be able to sustain for the longer term investments in conflict. How, therefore, is it going to be able to sustain this and sustain social cohesion? If it does not sustain social cohesion, you're going to have poison, which is going to have challenges for the country's sustainability, which will have challenges for regional sustainability and stability, which is why Ethiopia's neighbors are entitled to be worried. This leads me to my final point, and that is the governance outlook for the region. And as I was telling some colleagues yesterday, when you look at the countries of the Nile Basin, the outlook is challenging, the governance outlook. First of all, apart from the DRC, Kenya, and Tanzania, every one of those countries is ruled by a soldier. Increasingly, or either a soldier or a fighter, and increasingly, civic issues and political issues are being resolved through the gun, because soldiers like to shoot. They think everything can be sorted out by shooting. And political dialogue is no longer viable as a means of addressing social challenges. Or rather, if to the extent that it is viable, it is not seen as a first option. How do we as civil society return political dialogue to the table and persuade these rulers who wear or remain in uniform that it still has value in our societies? This, I think, is the advocacy, as I end, of those Africans who are saying, can we return political dialogue to the table in this situation? And I hope that we can find common cause with our colleagues from the region and from particularly in Ethiopia in negotiating modalities for introducing and reinserting political dialogue and giving it primacy in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mzee Chidi. Always a pleasure listening to you speak about something that is very close to your heart. We are now going to open up for questions to the plenary. So if you have any question, you can either put it in the chat room or you can raise up your hand, and Abdul will help me to pick those ones who have put up their hands. You can ask your question, you can direct it to a particular panelist, and then we can take a first round of about 5 questions, and then we'll come back to the second round. I have seen quite a number of people in the participating. We are already about 84. I want to welcome to the group many of you who I know. I can see Brian Kagoro, I can see Don Dea, I can see Muthoni Wanyeki, James Gondi, Sarah Mukasar, Don Marish, Ibrahim Khan, and many, many more. And these are people who have really have a grasp on what happens in the region. They too can contribute on this discussion. So the floor is open and you can now start getting your contributions or questions. Thank you. Abdul, can you see anyone who has put up their hand?
Yes, I think we have a question from Abiy Gede. Can you?
Yes.
Yes, Abiy. Unmute.
Thank you, Abdul. Abiy Gede, I'm from the United States. I'm originally from Ethiopia, particularly from the region of Tigray. If I make one statement and just going to my question, and I really impressed by the panelists' message. I think the main issue is the lack of clarity on the narrative. And Ethiopia, to me, is just in the verge of collapse. As one speaker said, we oversimplify it, but this conflict is not about TPLF and Prime Minister. This has been a continuation of the crisis started 2.5 years ago from the Oromo movement to other part of the country's conflict. So the panelists actually touched all the points. I don't want to repeat that. Of course, when I was very young, I was a torture survivor. I was in prison. I'm a living witness about the conflict, it's a war. And now I'm sitting here in the United States and seeing the same trend and the same cycle coming back to our men and women and back home. And as the last speaker said, it's not about the Ethiopian issue, it's not about Tigrayan issue, it's about African issue. For that matter, it's about the humanitarian issue that Saba and others concerned. I wish I would be one of the panelists to present all my case studies on this issue, but as far as the time now, I just want to know what ICG success story on intervening in such issues. One thing I see, I'm happy about addressing the clarity is one area because the narrative still is so distorted. As one of my colleagues say, it is not about law and order. It is already, the world is witnessing, it is ethnic cleansing, ethnic profiling, and it's just here, looming the genocide already we have seen in Mekelle, and I don't want to bore you with all, even though we black out from everything, from every access. I have a family from the very capital city of Tigray, and I have no idea who is living and who is just killed. And it's very painful to address such issues in that position, but I really thank you very much for the panelists for addressing this issue. But my question is, this organization has a long story, and I see the panelists' concerns, but what is the actual plan? What success story do we have in intervening and helping? Are we focusing on the humanitarian crisis to help the victim of war? Or are we advocating the basic cause of this crisis and just partnering and awareing the whole world to get out of the whole mess? Not particularly, killing and feeding. That I think one of the speakers say we're working on the humanitarian. The government cannot help Tigray region at this point, and he cannot, or Prime Minister Abiy cannot feed the people he already killed. And I know I'm close to that society. If you talk about Ethiopia, that is the beginning of everything. If we call Ethiopia and marginalizing Tigray, I am not sure if Ethiopia is going to be the same after the end of this war. So our concern is how fast, how swift are we helping to make this world get the clarity and jump in to save or to stop or to de-escalate, whatever de-escalate is, this problem. So just to wrap up, I know I'm not a speaker, I just have to come to the point. What success story do we see from ICG, and what is the actual action plan now? What is the purpose of this conversation? And there is a leadership on the ICJ. What is the next action plan that we can help to voice the voiceless? And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Go on, Abiy. Go on, Dismas.
No, go on. I was thanking him. Have you got another one?
Yes, of course we do. We have quite a few, and Abiy, your question is quite valid. I think at some point we will tell you more about some of the things that Kenyan civil society organizations did when we were faced in a similar situation. And I think Saba also asked that same question. What can Ethiopians learn from other civil society organizations and human rights defenders from other countries that would be of help? And we will get to that in the course of this discussion. Thank you so much for that question. I want us to hear as well from Fiseha Tekle from Amnesty International, because they've done a report and a statement recently that DFROZ issued, and that could give us more insight about this situation. Fiseha? Fiseha, you can unmute. Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, and also not only for organizing, but also for the good list of panelists who have given us a good overview of the situation and also the regional implications of this conflict. As you have said, I just want to give you some insight about the human rights impact of this conflict, which started on 4th of November last month. So it's almost a month since it started. But as you may know, in this conflict, we have seen a number of human rights concerns. Some of them are related to the conflict. Some of them are outside of the conflict, but in other parts of the country, but related to the conflict. So in Mekelle and places like the western part of Tigray, there has been long cleavage and disagreement over territory. We have seen the Mekelle massacre, and according to our findings, at least like hundreds of people were killed, but the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has said that at least 600 people were killed, and that massacre had an ethnic element to it. But what we know about Mekelle can just be the tip of the iceberg, because as you know, there was no internet and mobile communication in areas which are affected by the conflict. And so we managed to get some information about the Mekelle situation on the 9th and 10th of November, but we don't really know what transpired in the context of the conflict in other parts of Tigray. So there are allegations about ethnically motivated attacks in Humara, Dansha, and even Raya, that's the southwestern part of Tigray. So we will be able to know the full extent of the civilian casualties due to the conflict when communication is going to be back. So we know there are some developments in terms of communication. Now internet and phone is back in the western part of Tigray, and the Ethiopian Telecommunication Corporation has said that they are working on restoring communication. So by then, and with physical access, we will be able to know the human rights impact, at least on the civilians. In addition to that, the closure of internet and mobile communication is also another concern, not only for human rights organizations, but also for coordinating humanitarian responses to the conflict. Humanitarian organizations were serving the vulnerable groups in Tigray, like the Eritrean refugees and also people who need livelihood support, were not able to coordinate their activities because of lack of communication. In addition to that, this internet and communication shutdown has affected people. Families and friends were not able to communicate to their family members, to their friends who were trapped in this conflict, and they are still in deep worry. So this the internet or the communication element of impact of the conflict is also very critical. And we are also concerned about the well-being and safety of Eritrean refugees in Tigray. As you might know, there are about 100,000 Eritrean refugees in 4 refugee camps in Eritrea. And there are a number of allegations coming about attacks on refugee camps, kidnap of refugees from Tigray to Eritrea, unconfirmed actually, but likely, and also killings of refugees who are caught in the crossfire. So the well-being and the safety of Eritrean refugees is really a concern. Yesterday there was some agreement between the UN and the Ethiopian government for humanitarian access, but we don't know how much the refugee camps will benefit from that, because it is not clear which party to the conflict is really controlling the areas of the refugee camps. The other worrying development after the conflict has started is internal displacement, which is least known. We have talked about refugees that managed to cross to Sudan, but there are internal displacements within Tigray and within Ethiopia to Amhara region and to Afar region. So there are internal displacements, their well-being and their safety is also a concern. The other situation is ethnic profiling of people of Tigrayan descent, which is happening in many parts of the country. And also the Prime Minister has acknowledged that in his speech to the parliament. And there have been movement restrictions on ethnic Tigrayan people. There have been profiling, search and seizure to their houses. And some of them were forced to stay out of their work. So that's also a very concerning situation in this conflict situation. And now, following the telecommunication disruption due to the conflict, banks remained closed for more than 3 weeks. I'm not sure if they have opened today, but up to yesterday, there was no banking. And that it's not only about having access to money, it's also about having access to essential services and provisions, including food, water, medicine. So that is really a worrying situation for people in Tigray, because they cannot use their money and buy food or other essential services. So these are some of the main human rights concerns we are having about the situation in Tigray. But I would like to also reflect on some of the things about CSO, says the Ethiopian local CSO. We have to know that the Ethiopian CSO has a gap, and because of the law that was implemented since 2009 up to 2018. And that has really left the Ethiopian civil society without any capacity. And we can't blame the civil society for lack of action in this conflict, because they are still having that capacity gap, and self-censorship is really understandable. So I see there is a lot of role for the regional and international partners and civil society to support the capacity of the local civil society and enhance their role in these kinds of context. The other thing which I would like to add is that Ethiopia is not new to conflicts, and atrocity crimes are not new, actually. What happened in Mekelle, it might be the most severe kind that happened overnight, but it was not something new. Since the beginning of Derg, and also since the beginning of the Oromo protest, and even in Somali region, we have seen a lot of atrocity crimes. But those atrocity crimes have never been dealt properly. There was no accountability, there was no reparation, there was no historical justice. And what I'm really worried is that this cycle of violence, if not properly addressed, it's going to continue. So transitional justice, which is focused on addressing the past and guiding the future of the country, is much needed, but it has never been properly implemented. So transitional are critical and much needed in Ethiopia. So we don't have to restrict our scope to this conflict, but we have to look at the history which is driving violence and just getting worse as the time goes on. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiseha. We have several questions, and I think we'll now give Zena Tesfaye. You had a question for the panelists.
I did. Thank you so much. I have a question for the panelists that have spoken so far. But before that, I want to just say thank you so much to the two ladies that spoke, both not because they're just women, but because they both spoke on something that was very genuine and real. And then Brother Chide, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. And if I feel like it's an Igbo name, and therefore your story about the 1967 Biafra thing is very real to me in terms of what you said. Ethiopia is too big to be abundant to Ethiopians. And I often say the same thing about whether it's Ambazonia, which was, you know, happening right as our 2015 November, we were unraveling with the master plan that brought all of this crisis to the fore. So yes, and yes, and yes. And of course, now I'm gonna take, I'm a little bit taken aback by Ato Fisaha, or I think it's the lawyer Fisaha who just spoke, because he did exactly what I was most scared of. And I think it's Brother Zito who's been basically talking about this on Twitter and on other platforms. And in all honesty, I'm not shocked, but because I'm not what's it called? I'm not an activist. I'm a human rights and civil rights advocate. So in that sense, I'm not numb enough and strong enough not to have my voice break as I speak. So I'll ask for your forgiveness for this. But essentially, the point is there are no CSOs in Ethiopia. There were CSOs before 2005 or whatever that date is that the previous speaker has spoke on. And then, of course, the narrative is Melles's government and the TPLF, and of course, we never talk about APDRF anymore. And Melles's government was so repressive that the CSOs were not empowered. Whatever empowerment they had been given was taken away immediately by political repression, which is actually not a fact to begin with. So right there is there's a break in logic. I'm an anthropologist in some area, and I'm an art historian, and I have my basic, knowledge, what's it called, cross-disciplinarian to many degrees. So I'm just going to try to address it really quickly now that I've said that, right? So here goes. As Ethiopians, we're not good at worrying about our neighbors. We're worried about maybe our children and maybe about our mom or our dad. So we don't take that personal responsibility to say, well, what if that happens to me, But in Amharic, there's a word that's called negbene, which means, hey, I better do something so this doesn't happen to me tomorrow. But we have long abandoned that with the coming of modern education and so forth and so on, right? So like the whole breakdown in ethics and taking care of each other's as a what's it called, as a village, So we don't live by that anymore. So let's not kid ourselves. There is no civil society, and it wasn't Melles's fault, and it wasn't TPLF's fault. And it's because we as a people have become very selfish and have become extremely modern, that we think not caring about the next person is okay. So I'm going to put that to rest right there. And then quickly come forward to 2015 in November with the master plan. It broke down. It broke down just like it did in Cameroon. They asked for teachers. They sent them French teachers instead of English-speaking teachers. They sent them English-speaking judges when they know very well they speak the other one, the French language, right? So that, as silly as that was, there was a whole bunch of context behind it. Same thing as Biafra. Why some guy in China would have to jump 22 floors because he was being chased by the Nigerian government, and his whole, bones were broken as you saw him kind of creep. And so I bring these images and these stories because I'm certain you're very, very aware if you're in the ICJ and you care about human rights and so forth. So now, dismissing and completely sidelining the Tigrayan issue, which was done by Ato Fissaha, and I'm just going to go right there and say, how in the world are we even going to heal or use our CSOs to do anything if we're not going to be honest? So honestly, the only people that protect Eritrean refugees in Tigray was the Tigrayan government and the Tigrayan people. That's one. Number two, the only people that have been, and I'm not going to say I'm not going to say this about everything about Ethiopia, but in the current Tigrayan context, the only people that should be protected right now in Tigray are the Tigrayans. The Tigrayans that went to Sudan, they were very clear. They said, we are not going back to Ethiopia because we see what Abiy's government can do. We have tried our best. We have tried every peaceful means of resistance, and we have maintained and protected our region and decided to have an election in spite of the fact that Abiy's regime decided there's no election due to this and that, and we still managed to do it. And now you're telling us that you can come back home under the auspices of the federal government and the PP unelected administration, and then to add insult to injury, whatever the UN passage, this unfettered passage thing is being thought of as, okay, we'll just give them that. But in all honesty, we have to have the UN rapporteurs go in there and find out exactly what happened, because unless there's independent investigation, it's just going to be the person that has the most money is going to win. And right now, Abiy's government has the most money from Saudi Arabia, the US, and the only one that's actually kind of threatening him a little bit is the EU, saying, well, we're not going to give you any money unless you at least have one or two things, at least you begin to sort some things out. So just give me another 30 seconds to say this. The repression, right? Sorry, and then just to address Mesfin's word, or was that the Constitution is to blame for all this because we never did have a clear understanding. Well, yeah, because we had a clear understanding is how we came to the Constitution. But all of this, it boils down to first, we have to sort ourselves out locally, and then we can sort ourselves out nationally, and then regionally, and then continentally. So now that it's too late to do all that, we have to be able to open ourselves, have UN rapporteur investigators. The Maikadra was Tigrayans that were killed all over Western Humera and so forth. And we have refugees that can tell you all of that. And Abiy's government already sent people to intimidate the refugees to stop them from telling their stories. So I can't give you, I can give you, if you let me, I can talk for 2 years from now,
yes,
and I can give you the whole thing by heart, and I'm not going to do that. So I'll just
I think
politely
Zena,
stop. I'll just politely
thank
stop
you
by
so
saying
much. Yes.
thank you, and please, let's not abandon Ethiopia to Ethiopians, because we're all going to suffer. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Zana. This is exact. We are not really doing that. The whole objective of this is to bring African civil society activists together in solidarity with Ethiopians. So we are very much heeding to Chidi's call. We are not abandoning Ethiopia. So next, we do have some questions, but I'm going to ask colleagues, please keep your questions short and precise because we still need the panelists to respond. It would be helpful if you ask the question and say who you would like to respond to that question so that we can give an opportunity to the panelists to respond. I have Sina Jimjimo, and then I also have Wanza. So Sina, can we please have your question short and precise? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for all the speakers, and thank you for organizing things. And my question is for, I guess, one of the person I want to answer is Fasaha from Amnesty, since I heard his voice. And my question is very straightforward. While I share what's happening in Tigray, and we have I work on an Oromo advocacy organization, so I'm going to focus more about what's happening in Oromo, because what's happening has been happening in Oromia. It's been 2 years in the coming. There have been reports of extrajudiciary killing by Amnesty International. There have been mass arrests last year, not this year. In the last 6 months, there have been over 1,000 killing. There have been thousands of refugees in Kenya that are extremely vulnerable. The organizations such as UN, even ICJ or Amnesty, I'm not so sure if there's anything that has been done. And I was wondering, my first question is, I have 3 questions, is that, is there any hope ICJ or Amnesty can do for these refugees and for what's happened to Oromos in Oromia over the last at least 2 years at minimum since Abiy came to power? Is there any plan to include the Oromo issues, the larger issue, in this discussion in the future? My second question is, as Oromo, we are worried the issue is portrayed as between some bad regional government in Tigray versus federal government or all other Ethiopians. Will ICJ and Amnesty, and I can rephrase the issues really facing Ethiopia, because I feel like at least based on Amnesty's report, there is quite sufficient evidence that the issue is not just between bad apple or regional governments versus just the rest of the country. My third question is that there have been, again, over 1,000 killings in the last 6 months alone in Oromia, and many organizations, early on, Amnesty had saved a few stuff, but I don't know if ICJ or other organization has said much about what happened in Oromia. Without proper documentation from such organization, it is hard for us here who are based in Washington to kind of advocate on this killing, because for as far as they care, it didn't happen. And I can give you just an example that a mother, a 1-year-old child, and then another one is arrested because they're looking for her dad. And we tried to write that story and we got pushed back because, like, did anybody report on it? Did anybody pin it? And then my own personal friend was just killed a couple of days ago. And he's a father of 2 children. And we tried to report on his case too, but the question every time is the pushback. Okay, do you have any evidence? Did Amnesty say something about it? My last question is in short, does the ICJ and Amnesty or any other organization that you guys work have any plan to really say what's happening in other parts of Ethiopia, not just the war, because the issue about Abiy is much larger, and especially the Oromo issue is the heart of this. And without you guys saying something about it, it kind of minimizes the problem. And thank you for the chance.
Thank you, Sina. I've seen some hands have gone down, but we do have a question from the chat room from Zito Kabwe, and this one is for our Ethiopian colleagues in the panel, Masood and Saba. And Zito asks, is there a domestic investigation or documentation that has been done by civil society organizations in Ethiopia regarding the ethnic profiling and the recent violations? So I think, having received those questions, we probably want to go back to the panelists to respond. And we could start with Saba and Masood.
Abdul, thank you for doing that. We are now going to we have about 17 minutes to go. So we are going to go to the panelists, and then they give us if they have specific questions that they need to answer, or if they have any other comment that they want to relate to the presentations or to the suggestions that have been made. And then if there's any other question, we'll pick them up. But as for now, let's go back to the panelists. We start with the Mesedu. You have a question which has been directed to you.
Thank you. So for the questions, I have been looking some of the questions on the chat box. Maybe if local civil societies have say on this ethnic profiling, and maybe I was responding on that. And if you have seen the Ethiopian Human Rights Council press statement on that, there have been reports to the council at the airport, and even as it is mentioned in some government offices, some Tigrayans have been either ordered to get leave or like that kind of things. And we have emphasized that such ethnic profiling would lead to some kind of fear, and as Fisa has been trying to, it won't help for the transitional justice that we are really anticipating. So in terms of in terms of some of the perspectives, I've been looking about how far local civil societies have been advocating as human rights defenders, and I need to reflect on what Chidi has said. Of course, I do respect the opinion of some. Of course, I'm from civil society, and I won't comment on your personal and opinions. But so now we are in this problem. So we have been witnessing atrocities in different parts of the country. As Sena has been mentioning, there have been lots of atrocities in Oromia, in Benshangul Gums, now in Tigray, and in many more parts of the country. So as civil societies, and as Fisa was mentioning, we really don't have the capacity to investigate. And of course, Zena was mentioning it is not the problem of the government, but I should be frank with you, it has been institutionalized to suppress local civil society organizations, not to advocate. And if you see, for instance, our organization background, we started having Zero in 2015, and because of the institutionalized and the draconic legal frameworks, of course, that were the reflection of the regime, we were not able to have Zero as human rights organizations coming together. So this is already gone, but we have to learn, and we need to build institutions like having strong local human rights advocacy organizations. For instance, Chile has been trying to see it is not something internal matter. Of course, Sudan has been affected. Maybe Eritrea has been also similarly affected. So what? So as civil societies, what are we, as civil society leaders, what are we advising? Of course, we are not historians. We can't do that, and we are urgency on providing humanitarian assistance as children, as women, as people with disabilities, and many more marginalized people, even those who had the capacity. But even we had lots of IDPs, I mean refugees in the region, in the Tigray region, but we really are not sure how safe are they if they are not yet compelled to do this or that kind of human rights violations on them. So the internet shut down, the infrastructure, of course, Ethio Telecom has been saying that some of the infrastructures were damaged, but I mean, like as this internet shutdown has been practiced for a couple of times for some political reasons, I mean, I don't really agree on that. However, there might be such infrastructure damage, as we witnessed that some of the bridges and even public service institutions have been damaged. In terms of condemning the human rights violations, we have been I mean, like, we are civil society organizations and we need evidence. We can't say, as we hear from different medias, the tweets of different activities, we need evidence. So as far as this issue, we have only evidence from the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and Amnesty about their preliminary reports. Still, I was mentioning that they didn't have the full picture of why it was, who was really involved with, who should be accountable, and this needs more investigation. And maybe those civil society organizations who are part of this panel discussion need to support local civil society organizations to investigate. And as Fisa said, we need to come up with some kind of transitional justice. I mean, like, it needs to stop somewhere. I mean, it should be that it should be now that the time that such kinds of problems want to be continued. Maybe for about the social values that we lost, I partially agree with some of the points they not mentioned. We Ethiopians say that we are proud of many of our histories, but we are really losing those social fabrics. We are really losing some of the very important social fabrics that we need to live with. And of course, for that, we need to improve lots of things, and we need to use indigenous knowledge system as well as such institutions. And for that, I ask all of you who are part of this panel to support local civil society organizations to work on this, and so that those who are involved in this should be accountable, and some kind of impunity should I mean, like, there should be no more impunity, and everyone engaged should be accountable. For that, we need institutions, and we need to support local civil society organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Masood. Thank you very much. Do we have Hala? Do you have any? Hala, do you have any response?
Well, I have two comments, that I'd like to share. One, and I'm going to share that from just a broader perspective to the Ethiopians, brothers and sisters, and the colleagues at the regional level. Peace does not come cheap. It's equally, I mean, it's not as expensive and costly as conflict, apparently, but it also has a price, and it requires a capacity to endure, and I think it's about time to change the dynamics of engagements with each other, not to succumb and accept, the fact that we can easily kill each other and brutalize each other's, and normalize that. I think we have learned our lessons, and we have been through cycle of conflicts, through the years that we have been alive, my generation, the generation before us and after us. So I really think that as civil society, we need to start thinking about, modality of, as Saba has said in her presentations, of how we can actually heal and how we can reconnect with each others. And I also, speaking about the whole issue of changing the modality of engagement, I think it's really very important, to enable women to have a leading role in this conversation, a meaningful leading role in this conversation, and not to alienate or sideline or undermine women leadership in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hala. Saba?
Thank you very much, and thank you all. I think it was very interesting and refreshing also to see diverse opinions rather than saying the same things only on one side. But I can see that there are different aspects of the situation of the conflict, or on how we want to represent it. So That's why we need this kind of space. So when I think of civil society, Zena has said that there is no civil society, and some of us would say there is. And what I think is that civil society is all about space. This space that we are having today, it creates much more opportunity to find ways of solving problems and of showing, of influencing others, of directing ourselves and looking back and reflecting on what we're doing to each other. As Hala said, that normalizing conflict, after some time we'll find it very normal that people are dying and we say, oh, is it 100 people or 200 people? Because killings and deaths of civilians will be so normalized that it will just be about number. So I think having a space will help people to be conscious of what they're doing rather than being led by some populist ideas or someone who's highly influential or someone who has the upper hand at the moment. But instead, the civil society should always go against the tide and say what we think is right. We might be wrong, but at that moment, if we find something with evidence, of course, if possible, and if we find something is not right, if we believe that it will be very harmful for our people, harmful for women, children, harmful for our constituencies, and for the country at large, for the politics, then we have to say it loud and come up with it. Why we're not doing that, as I said earlier, is one is because of our own inclinations of ideas, of our support to one another, and then we don't want to shed light, even sometimes when we know that that certain things are not true. We put them on Facebook or we put them on our platforms. So we're not being responsible, even as civil society organizations. We are not just other citizens, but we are leading some kind of issues, some kind of political, economic, and social issues on the table. Then we have to be responsible rather than just putting evil on the government or any other government, political parties or actors. Then we have to look at why are we saying certain things? How would that help? How would that help to bring people together? How would that help to bring peace and resolve as well? Also bring justice to the people. So I want to say that civil society is a space, and as much as we don't say things, as much as we don't represent, as someone said, the voiceless, or those people, because of certain, everybody has a voice, I know that, but because of that situation, of that specific situation at this moment, for example, we don't know what's happening in Tigray, except what we're hearing from one channel. We can say, okay, this is enough. As much as they tell me this, I can rest assured that everything is okay. Or I can go further and say, we need to have other kind of source of information where the media or other civil society can go in and really look at how the people are surviving, or how services are provided, or how the war or whatever the conflict they call it affected the citizens. As long as we don't opt to do that, I don't think, like Hina said, maybe we should be not really, we are not becoming relevant to our society, to our country, even to the government, because maybe the government may need some kind of push, some kind of advocacy, some kind of lobbying. So as long as we don't play those roles, I think we become irrelevant. Then we become, we will not be needed, as that's our role that it should be. But I really want to thank everyone who was presented here as well, because we learned a lot. But I still want to encourage us to see what worked well in other countries. How can we become, how can we be constructively, not in a adding some more fire to the problem, more problem, but becoming a solution by creating that safe space, by creating that neutral space. Nobody will ask me of my independence if I'm on behalf of the people, on behalf of the the country of the peace if I'm saying these things. Rather, if I am putting my agenda on the spot, and then I will be judged and say, next time when I'm talking about human rights, about or violence, even violence against women, then I will be judged by what I'm doing on my social media. So I think we need to take very serious action in this regard and be responsible, I think, as civil society, but do more. I know that we're not investigating. I can tell you that we're not doing any investigation. Yes, things are happening in Oromia, things are happening in Benshangul, in Tigray, in other parts, but which civil society is investigating, having an independent investigation? I don't know, really. I don't think we have done that. We cannot fool ourselves on that. We're very cautious. We're very careful not to touch anybody's, not to push much. So unless we get to be heard and do something, then I don't know why we are here. But thank you, everyone, and thank you, Hala, for your contribution, and everyone.
Thank you, Saba. Thank you very much. Muzei Chidi?
Thanks a lot, Dismas, and to my colleagues on the panel, but also to the participants. I hope that the organizers, Abdul, would harvest the chat because it's very rich in perspectives. And I'm grateful that we've had a diversity of perspectives here, which is really useful for this kind of dialogue on a situation as we have. I should note in particular that the fact that we've got someone like Zito here who has his own battles to fight, negotiate in Tanzania, being very active in this should, I hope, be reassuring to our colleagues from Ethiopia and in Ethiopia about the interest and the genuineness of the interest here. And I think it's also appropriate to transmit solidarity to the colleagues from Tanzania who are in this in particular, and also to colleagues in Uganda who have to go for campaigns now with Kevlar and helmets, including Dismas. Now, I just say three things here. The point has been made about transitional justice. I don't think anybody will question that. That will be helpful. But transitional justice doesn't just follow upon a conflict, and it doesn't unfold overnight. Those who remember the trials of the Derg finished only in December 2012. That's a mere 8 years ago. And several of them never came to justice, and the Derg was fired in 1991. So I think that's going to take time. Before we get there, I think it is important that the narrative issue and the factual and evidentiary issues are addressed. One of the points made by Brian Kagoro on the chat is that belligerents hide their indiscretions. And when you talk of belligerents, you have more than one side. But there is one side here, which is the federal government, which is recognized as an international entity and is the only one that can allow people into Ethiopia for purposes of any fact finding. If they say you can't go, you can't come in, you can't come in. If they say you can only go so far, you can only go so far. And the circumstances, therefore, of fact finding will be critical. We can say, well, the only thing that has been publicized is atrocities by one side. Well, if the underlying control mechanisms only allow for atrocities by one side to be seen or known about, that's what is going to happen. How do we ensure that the situation is conducive for an even-handed investigation into the possibilities of atrocities by all sides? I think that's a question we've got to address. And that is really central to the narrative building. And everything I hear here convinces me this is a contest of a narrative shaping and narrative building. Whose stories do you want to shape or hear? How do you want to hear them? Whose stories are allowed to be amplified? To what extent? How do we ensure as civil society that all sides to the contest have a decent shot at being heard. All sides, apart from sides that are advocating, from any sides that are advocating for crimes, as in war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. But with that limitation, how do we ensure that all sides of the political contest, and this is the immediate trigger, of course, I know there is a history, but the immediate trigger is a political situation over elections, and COVID triggered that. How do we ensure that we don't lose sight of that particular trigger in this? And let me go back to where I began. 5th of May, 1941 is a critical date in the history of Ethiopia. That was the day the emperor returned from exile. And that operation was run by Churchill, authorized by Churchill, and run from Sudan. On that day, the regiments that were present on the return of the emperor came from Egypt, they came from Sudan, they came from Kenya, and they came from Nigeria. As a matter of fact, the Kenyan regiment, the Sudan regiment let the emperor's team into the country. The Kenyan regiment let him into Addis. The Nigerian regiment received him into his palace. Many of those Africans from these countries never went back to their countries because they continued fighting the war. Many of them lost their lives in that war. They are buried in Ethiopia. We, as Africans, we follow our umbilical cords. Ethiopia is that important to us, and we will not let you be until Africans are able to be reassured that this cradle of our sovereignty as a people has returned to some form of balance and normalcy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mzee Chidi. Thanks all panelists. I'll ask Abdul to say a few words and then I will close. Abdul?
Thank you, Dismas. It has been a very interesting discussion, and some of the questions that have come forward a lot is how can they learn from the neighboring countries? And that's an important question. Even Abe asked, what is this all about? Now, when we went through our own violence in 2007, 2008, civil society organizations had to come together and they had to form a coalition in order to see how they could resolve a problem that had faced our own country. That coalition was made up of diverse organizations that some had worked together, but some had not worked together before. It came together organically, and it became what is now known as Kenyans for Peace, Truth and Justice, KPTJ. It is an organization, a coalition that is going on, and a coalition that continues to advocate for truth and justice and accountability for that violence in 2007 and 2008. It is a very important coalition made up of no more than 10 or 15 heads of those organizations. But it became very important in advocating for accountability. It may seem that a few people are not able to do much, but KPTJ has gone on to be very strong and to be one of the most important coalitions to advocate for justice. And I would request our Ethiopian partners, if there's one thing that will be most important now, is for different CSOs from different parts of the country to come together and form a coalition that would ask for accountability and justice, not only for what has happened in Tigray, but what continues to happen in different parts of the country, whether it is in Amhara, in Afar, in Somali, Oromia, Gambela, wherever they would need accountability, a coalition would help you to do that, just as KPTJ has done and continues to do for the violations in 2007 and 2008, for electoral justice and all forms of constitutional accountability since then. We also learned one thing, that what we thought affected only Kenya affected every other country. And we have learned something very important, that whatever happens in any part of Africa affects all of us. So since then, different organizations have made sure that we send messages of solidarity and that we come together to make sure we advocate in all platforms, wherever there's trouble in any part of this continent. whether it's in Uganda or Tanzania or Burundi or the DRC or in Nigeria or Cameroon. So as Chidi says, you are not alone. We are going to advocate with you, but we would request that you also help us to get information, because we can only know what you know. And don't be surprised that a few people cannot make changes. KPTJ proved that a few people can make a lot of changes and can push a lot of boundaries and open doors. Just as Margaret Mead says in her famous quote, "No doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdul. Thanks very much, all the participants and the panelists that came together. Just to reassure you that even what Abdul is talking about Kenya, we have so many African civil society organizations that did quite a lot of work in order to bring about the understanding of the conflict in Kenya. It's the same, and interestingly, we did it in Addis Ababa, and it's the same thing that we can do only if, like Abdul said, we get information, we can be able to act. We are not shy, and we can even take on the mighty. We have done it before. So do let us know what are the important things that you want to carry forward, and we'll be able to stand with you, as we don't want to see Ethiopia become another historical history in the history of atrocity crimes that has happened on the continent. On that note, we wish you all the best. Thanks for participating. We'll let you know what, if ever, or if we think that there is a necessity for us to have another meeting, we certainly will let you know after we consult with ICJ Kenya. Thank you very much and goodbye.